The list that I started on this slide could go on and on. There is tremendous diversity in the United States. I just really want you to understand that not only are children going to be diverse from each other, they are going to see diversity in the world. You are going to have diverse children in your classroom who come from diverse families, and you got to figure it out. So you have to make sure that you're ready, that you understand all the different kinds of diversity that are potentially coming your way. And one, check your own baggage at the door. We all have biases, so we need to think about what those are and do our best to check them before we walk into our professional environments. And then also the next job, which we'll talk about later in the lecture, is how do we help children understand that diversity and not check their biases because they haven't quite developed them yet, but avoid developing biases in the first place. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, there is great diversity in the world, and unfortunately that diversity doesn't necessarily mean everything is all sunshine and roses and that we all love each other and that we all accept each other. So that was the other piece I was saying, is that we all have biases. Children haven't quite gotten there yet, but they will. Although there are some biases that start fairly early, not as significant as we have, but the bottom line is that bias exists. And because we know that bias exists and diversity exists, we need to do what we can to counteract bias. Because if we're going to live in a diverse world, and we know that we might be biased against people who are not exactly like us, we need to do whatever we can to mitigate that so that we can live in that diverse world in a more healthy and advantageous way to everybody. So on this slide and the next slide, I wanted to talk with you just about bias and sort of what we know about bias. So in early childhood, children are learning about themselves and others. That's part of what young children are doing. And part of this process, as we will see on slide 6, involves categorizing themselves in groups and determining who fits in those groups and who doesn't. So on slide 6, we're going to be looking at some of those 36, 48, and 60-month milestones so you can have an understanding of what it is young children are working on in terms of themselves and others, and how they're categorizing humans in the world around them. They're categorizing all kinds of objects, and humans are part of that. So although this is a natural process, it is natural to look at yourself and look at your own personal characteristics and then look around you and look at other people's characteristics. Unfortunately, this leads to something called in-group bias, which is an inborn human tendency to favor people who are like you, to favor people who think like you, to favor people who look like you, to favor people who engage in the same activities as you. This is just built into human nature. And so as children are categorizing themselves and they're categorizing other people, they naturally exhibit in-group and out-group bias because this is what humans do. This is part of our genetic makeup. So you can see that the definition under this third bullet is that in-group bias is the tendency to favor one's own group, its members, its characteristics, and its products, particularly in reference to other groups. So as children start categorizing people, they're going to start figuring out who's like them, physically, etc. And then those are the people who are going to be in the in-group, and people who are not like them are going to be in the out-group. Now, unfortunately, part of that genetic tendency to have in-group, out-group bias means that people who are in the out-group often get treated poorly. So you can see this fourth bullet, it says that this tendency towards in-group bias can lead to treating other groups poorly. So ultimately, many forms of discrimination and bias may develop not because out-groups are hated, but because positive emotions such as admiration, sympathy, and trust are reserved for the in-group. So it's not that I'm setting out to dislike people who aren't in my group. I'm just so busy giving all the good stuff to my group members that anybody who's not in my group doesn't get those kinds of things. They get whatever's left over, and that's not the good stuff. So I would really encourage you to watch the YouTube video clip on this slide. It gives you great information about how early this in-group bias starts. I was talking to my mom about this not too long ago, and she didn't believe that babies exhibit in-group bias or that babies can be disliking someone else very, very early in life. And I was sharing this experiment with her because it's just so powerful to show how so early in our life we like or dislike people based on such minute characteristics, and how early this is exhibited in our human existence. So if we know that in-group, out-group bias is a human tendency, and we know from the previous slide that even young children exhibit these types of biases, then we absolutely know that we as educators or as professionals working with young children and families are not immune to this kind of bias. So I want to share two pieces of evidence on this slide that bias exists within educators and professionals. So the first is looking at a Jane Elliott video. So this is showing how easily a teacher was able to create a very unfriendly, hostile environment for certain children in the classroom based on information that she was providing to them. It's quite famous. Jane Elliott is still alive and still speaks about this experiment. This is a longer video, but I am going to toss in an exam question just to encourage you to watch it. It's very good. It's kind of like the reject video that I asked you to watch earlier. But I also wanted to share with you some research by a gentleman named Gilliam. So if you're interested in this research, the graphic to the right, please let me know. I'll be happy to provide an article for you that you can read more about the work that Gilliam has done. But basically, they give teachers experiments and tell them that they should be on the lookout for challenging behaviors or inappropriate behaviors in the classroom. And they are asked to watch 4 different kinds of children. They're asked to watch white boys, white girls, and black boys and see if they can find incidents of challenging behavior. Well, in reality, none of the children in the videos that these teachers are asked to watch are exhibiting challenging behavior of any kind. But what they found is that teachers of all races, black teachers, white teachers, were tracking and watching children of color more than they were children who are white. And they also were more likely to identify challenging behaviors in children of color, even though none of the children were exhibiting challenging behaviors at all. So clearly we're primed not only to have these in-group, out-group biases, but to expect certain things from certain children in our classrooms. And you can see that black boys were the most likely to be watched. In addition, boys were more likely to be watched overall. So we had these teachers that were included in this experiment had racial biases, and they also had gender biases. So they were looking for particular kinds of children to be exhibiting particular kinds of behaviors, even if they weren't really exhibiting those behaviors at all. So it's just really important to understand that we are part of the equation, and so we need to really be examining ourselves and making sure that we're minimizing our own biases whenever we can. So as I said a couple slides ago, I did want to give you some developmental milestone information related to what children know about themselves and others. So this process of categorization. So in and of itself, the process of categorization is normal. It's what we do. Just like children are looking at colors and shapes and sizes, they're also looking at people and their characteristics. So that's just part of the human process to categorize and sort out and identify and describe. It's when those descriptions do lead to these biases and prejudice and unfair treatment of others, that's when it becomes problematic. So it's not that it's bad that children are noticing these differences, it's what they're going to do about that information. So that's where we come in, which we're going to talk more about on other slides. But in terms of just general developmental milestones, by about age 3, children should be able to identify themselves as members of one or more groups by referring to categories. So they may categorize people by gender or color of their skin or language that they speak. It's going to be obvious things that they can see. It might be more difficult for them to pick up on less tangible aspects of culture, but definitely those more obvious physical characteristics. They start to make comparisons between themselves and others. I often have children look at my skin and look at my freckles and comment on them and notice that they do not have freckles and that I do. Some children are looking at differences in skin color or differences in hair color, and this is very normal to start noticing that I look one way and you look another way. So at about age 4, children are kind of adding on to their understanding of these differences in people. So they are starting to understand language and cultural practices, starting to exhibit cultural, ethnic, racial identity, language practices of their own. They're very curious about people and diversity and human characteristics. It really is a wonderful time because they are very interested in the world around them and the differences that they see. Unfortunately, we do start to see those in-group biases being exhibited because already, even at age 4, there may be preference for the own group, particularly if there aren't opportunities to talk about and meet and get to know other people and see ways in which all people are alike, even if they differ in those more external characteristics. Also, 4-year-olds are all about rules and fairness and maintaining order. So again, this is also a great time to talk about, everybody can play. And that's why that Vivian Goosen-Paley's idea of you can't say you can't play works so well with this age, because they really do think that the world should be a fair place. So even though they might have these tendencies towards in-group bias, it's very easy to help them move away from that because they can easily see that that might not be fair. And so you have a lot of raw material to work with young children. By 60 months, so at age 5, so just even more identification with cultural, ethnic, and their racial identity. Again, they still show a lot of interest in human diversity, more strongly favor the characteristics of their own group, so that window is starting to pass. There's a lot of interest in diversity, but they're also really starting to hinge on the in-group characteristics. So we really want to make sure that 3, 4, and 5, we're really exposing children to diversity and talking about these issues with them. Because again, at 5, they still are really all about rules and protecting fairness, and so this is just an ideal time to talk about diversity issues with children. In addition to general milestones about understanding ourselves and others, I also wanted to dig into a few subtopics. So on this slide, we'll talk about gender awareness. On the next slide, we'll talk about racial awareness. And then the 9th slide, we'll talk about cultural awareness. So I just wanted to make sure that in addition, again, to those general milestones, that we understand these more specific topics. That should be helpful as you work with young children. So in terms of gender awareness, we expect children to really start paying attention to gender around age 2. They are able to sort activities and behaviors in terms of gender. So girls like pink and they like dolls and they're more gentle, whereas stereotypically boys like blue and trucks and they're more rough. We know that these are stereotypes and that they don't apply to all children, but these are stereotypes that children are picking up on, and they're starting to use them to to sort people out in terms of gender typical behaviors or what's considered to be gender typical. By about age 3, children are rewarding their same-sex peers for gender-appropriate behavior, and they're criticizing their peers for gender-inappropriate behavior. So boys might be starting to be picked on if they're displaying more feminine traits, and girls may be more accepted if they are exhibiting more feminine traits. So really starting to show those in-group, out-group biases with regard to gender by age 3. And by age 4, children are strongly influenced by gender norms in their society. So whatever information we've given them up to this point about what it means to be male or female, they have really taken this to heart, and they are really subscribing very strictly to those gender norms, both for themselves and other children around them. With regard to racial awareness, again, by about age 3 or 4, children should be able to start applying labels of at least black and white in terms of race. So definitely one of those characteristics that they can see and they're commenting on and using to sort people out. And then unfortunately, by elementary school, children have also acquired stereotypes about people of different colors. And we know that stereotypes aren't necessarily true, but they're ideas about what we think people are supposed to be like, and we're transmitting those ideas to children, and they are quickly absorbing them. They may exhibit prejudice towards people of other races. I would really encourage you to watch the YouTube video that I've included on this slide. It's a CNN kind of little documentary and shows some really interesting stuff about children's ideas about race and how early those prejudicial and stereotypical ideas and behaviors start occurring. Okay, so then we are also going to talk about cultural awareness, and I neglected to say on slide 7, when I said we were going to dig into children's knowledge about others, that on slide 10 we're also going to talk about social class awareness. But first let's do cultural awareness, and then we'll finish up with the one that I forgot. So in terms of cultural awareness, children are seeing evidence of varying cultural practices. They're realizing that not everyone does the same thing in the same way. They may dress differently, they may celebrate different traditions and holidays, they may eat different kinds of foods, just different ways for people doing things, that people often have different languages. So that also when we are talking about people, we may use different terms to talk about people of different groups. So we may have different vocabulary to describe the things that people eat, the ways in which they eat, the ways in which they speak to one another, the holidays that they celebrate. So unfortunately, if children have limited exposure to other people and other ways of doing things, and this is not normalized, they may start to think that other ways of doing things are atypical or wrong or not normal. And this can lead to stereotyping and prejudice. So stereotyping and prejudice generally emanates from either not understanding something, not having enough experience with it, or being afraid of it because it's not something that you're familiar with. So the best way that we can combat this is to give children lots of exposure and experience to different ways of doing things so that they have knowledge of other practices and that it reduces the fearfulness associated with not knowing. So the more open and inclusive that you can be, the more you can avoid the stereotyping and this prejudice. The other thing that children are starting to understand is what is considered to be dominant culture. And unfortunately, dominant culture comes with ideas that a dominant culture is better or more advantageous. And so especially for children who are living in what's considered to be minority cultures in whatever place they're living in, they may feel less self-worth. So we want to make sure that all children's beings, their persons, their cultures are being respected and included so that children of the dominant culture don't feel superior in some way and children in the minority culture don't feel like they are lesser than. I had a student once who told a story about a little girl in one of the classes that she taught, and I guess the little girl was wealthier than was typical of most of the other children in the class. And when it came to cleanup time, one day she declared that she didn't have to clean up and all the other children did. And when asked why, she explained that she has money and her family has a maid and she doesn't clean up. So it was the job of all of the other children. So even though young children's ideas about social class are a little bit rudimentary, a little bit rough, they do get it. They do get that when you have money, you have stuff, and sometimes you have more power and you have more privilege, And this little girl was clearly exercising her ideas about what it meant to be poor and what it meant to be rich. There's an article on the next slide for you to take a look at, but just kind of in a nutshell, what multicultural education is one, it helps children to learn more about themselves, to feel good about the person that they are, the family background that they come from, the traditions that they celebrate and uphold. It also helps them to learn more about other people, to learn that even though people are different, there are lots of ways that we are different from each other. There are also ways that we are the same, so helping them to learn more about, respect, understand others in the world around them. And then kind of the final piece, and that's what the quote is showing, is that, in addition to helping children learn about diversity, we also want them to learn about unfairness and to learn that it's not okay to treat people differently or to make assumptions about them just by looking at them. And young children aren't necessarily doing these things on purpose, but they do. They learn from us. They see differences, and we try to sweep them under the rug and not talk about them and pretend everybody is the same, even though it's clear when children look around that not everybody is the same. So a big part of a multicultural education or an anti-bias education is to help children to learn enough about each other so that they aren't fearful, they don't do harmful, hurtful things, they don't develop prejudice and all the different isms in the world. So it's a big job. We have to get started early so that by the time children get to elementary school, they haven't already taken on ideas that aren't true about people in the world around them. So as we've noticed previously in this lecture, there is a good reason for establishing a multicultural or anti-bias education approach in early childhood classrooms, because we know that children are aware of differences among people at an early age. This is just what human beings do. From the moment that we're born, we start looking around at the world around us and trying to make sense of that information, and that includes the people that exist in that world as well. We also know that that biased behavior begins early in life, so that in-group, out-group bias kind of stuff. So children and adults, teachers, do engage in biased, discriminatory behaviors if not checked about those kinds of things. And something we didn't really talk about previously is that children don't really have access to equal opportunities in life. So there's lots of evidence to show that children's educational experiences, their family experiences, differ along demographic lines. So families who are lower socioeconomic status, people of color, these are all groups where children may not get the same experiences, they may not receive experiences that are of the same quality, and then this sets them up potentially negatively later on in life. So because we know these things, it's really important to engage in multicultural anti-bias education. So this is a great video on this page. Again, I'd really encourage you to watch it. It talks very clearly about why multicultural education is needed and gives you some good ideas for how this can be done with young children. There are some known benefits of multicultural anti-bias education, so I just wanted to provide a few on this slide. So first of all, it just helps generally with classification skills, which is part of numeracy. It's part of math skills that children will need later on. So just like we know that it's important for children to classify colors, shapes, and sizes, it's also helpful for them to classify human characteristics. It's all part of that classification process of learning how to see the world in categories that can be created. So I'm not saying that we should create categories and then treat people differently, but it is okay for children to notice differences. There are differences in the world. There are differences in the way people look and speak and do things, and that's okay. So when children are doing that categorization, we also need to make sure that we talk with them about the similarities and differences that they see. So when we do talk about the differences and similarities that they see, it can potentially decrease prejudice and stereotyping because, again, we reduce those fears. We directly address misconceptions about people who are different. We don't just sweep things under the rug. We don't just pretend things aren't happening. We don't just let children say mean things when those mean things are not appropriate or true. We directly head on talk about these differences and the similarities among people, and then children are more comfortable and aware that those differences can lead to unfair treatment of certain people. It also helps children to broaden their personal experiences. So it's important to look beyond our own four walls and to realize that not everyone looks the same, does the same, is interested in the same things that we are. So to wrap up, let's talk about some ideas for ways that you can facilitate a multicultural or anti-bias education approach. So first, make sure that you teach appreciation for difference. Help children to see differences, help them to see that difference is good, that it makes the world a better place for not everybody to be the same. Also teach about the ways that we are all the same, that we all have things that we do that are similar, that we need to eat and sleep and love, and so explore those commonalities and then explore the different permutations of those commonalities. So those are two very important pieces. A third very important piece is to actively address any bias. So if you do see children saying hurtful or inaccurate things, talk about it and encourage them to treat each other with respect. So if a child says that another child with disabilities is a baby, help them to understand that that child is not a baby, that child just has different skills. Remember, that child, to them, anybody who has lesser skills is a baby, because that's really all they know about humans with lesser skills. And helping them to understand that just because someone has different or fewer skills than they do doesn't make them a baby, will help them to understand and appreciate and not say those kinds of things that are inaccurate. So not being mean, not coming down on them, not punishing them, but digging in, trying to understand why they're saying the things that they're saying, and then helping them to understand what the truth is, what the real accuracies are, so that everyone can be treated with respect. A great place to start is to learn about children's families. So really getting to know families, encouraging them to share things that they do at home, things that they could bring into the classroom. So that is a great starting point for any multicultural anti-bias education approach, is utilizing the things that the families and the children in your classroom are doing. And even better when you live somewhere like California, which is so diverse, so that we have a lot to draw on from the families and children that we're working with. Including topics that are relevant throughout the curriculum, so really being thoughtful about where you can insert multicultural, diversity, anti-bias kinds of education opportunities. Take a look at the YouTube video that I've included here, and that will give you more ideas about what I'm talking about with this piece. And then finally, just to wrap up, helping children to both treat others with kindness, to treat them in the way that they themselves would want to be treated, and also helping children to feel good about themselves. So these are really critical pieces. We want to feel good about ourselves, but not at the expense of someone else. So helping children to feel good and confident in their own selves, while also feeling respectful and good and kind to other people as well.